By the time the last tour bus pulls away from Bran and the souvenir stalls fold their metal shutters, the castle on the hill looks almost reasonable again. Just an old fortress in the Carpathian twilight, outlined against a fading purple sky. The daytime noise dies, the highway below becomes a quiet ribbon of headlights, and the floodlights begin to glow along the walls like a necklace of artificial moons. The gift shops are dark. The plastic vampire teeth, the rubber bats, the cheap "I survived Dracula's castle" t-shirts are all locked away. But up there, in that pile of towers and battlements, the day is not over, because this place was never built for daylight. It was born for the hours when you start to wonder whether the floorboards under your feet remember what they once soaked in. Imagine standing at the base of the hill in that moment. The forest around you is thick and dark, the kind of dark that your eyes never really get used to. The air smells of pine and stone and a little bit of diesel from the road. You look up, and Bran Castle seems to lean over the cliff almost a little too far, as if it's curious about you. People call it Dracula's castle, Europe's most cursed castle. A place of impalements, betrayals, ghosts, royal tragedies, Nazi whispers, communist secrets. A place where, if you believe the stories, the dead never really left, they just changed their uniforms. And here's the strange thing. If you strip all of that away, no vampires, no capes, no Hollywood, what you're left with is still a place that shouldn't exist. A fortress built on a knife edge between worlds, between mountains and lowlands, between empires, between Christianity and the Ottoman Crescent, between legend and paperwork, fear and taxation. Bran began as something very ordinary, a stone solution to a political problem. And yet century after century, people who came here walked away with the feeling that more than stone was watching them. Maybe that's why the legends cling to it. Maybe that's why so many different eras, so many different regimes tried to bend this castle to their will and ended up feeding its story instead. Merchants tried to turn it into a toll gate. A prince tried to turn it into a warning. A queen tried to turn it into a fairy tale home. Dictators tried to turn it into a neutral, sanitized museum. None of that really stuck. What stuck was this feeling, this whisper that keeps returning. Something here is cursed. Whether it's the building or the history it stands on, that's the real question. So let's start where every curse really begins, not with a spell or a ghost, but with geography. If you could pull back and look at a map of medieval Europe, your eye would be drawn east to a knot of mountains that look almost like a clenched fist. The Carpathians, dense, forested, difficult, full of passes that are both doors and choke points. One of those passes runs between Transylvania and Wallachia, two lands that spent centuries in a reluctant dance with each other. Upriver, you have Transylvanian Saxons and Hungarian kings. Downriver, Wallachian voivodes, and beyond them, the expanding shadow of the Ottoman Empire. Right where this pass narrows, where caravans had to slow down and watch their flanks, people built a wooden fort, then a stronger one. Then, in the 14th century, stone walls rose on the cliff. Bran Castle, not as an isolated fairy tale palace, but as a lock on a door that too many armies wanted to walk through. From the start, the castle's job was simple and ugly: control. Control the road, control the taxes, control who lived and who died when raiders came out of the south. The stones didn't care about glory or romance. They cared about range of arrows and angle of fire. They cared about how far a defender could roll a boulder before it hit an enemy helmet. But people are never content with practical explanations. The first time a fog rolled in and covered the road, but left the towers poking above it like islands. Somebody looked up and said, "The castle is floating on clouds. That can't be normal." The first time a caravan vanished in a snowstorm just below the walls, leaving only a broken wheel and a smear of red in the ice, someone muttered, "The hill is hungry." That's how it starts. Not with Dracula, but with muttered comments in taverns and quiet fears in the dark. In those early centuries, Bran was a Hungarian royal fortress, but in practice, it lived in the hands of the Transylvanian Saxons, German-speaking merchants from the city of Brasov. These were not caped lords of the night. They were businessmen. They looked at this pass and saw profit. Every cart of salt, wine, cloth, spices coming up from the Danube could be taxed at Bran. Every merchant who wanted safe passage could be squeezed a little harder if the guards on the walls looked bored enough to be dangerous. Picture it, a cold evening. A line of wagons snaking up the road, lanterns swinging, voices in half a dozen languages. Somewhere in the crowd, a Turkish trader fingering his prayer beads, a Venetian calculating exchange rates in his head, a Wallachian peasant just hoping nobody notices how thin his horses look. They all crane their necks up as they pass under the castle. Above them, dark slits in the stone, the eyes of archers. A wooden gatehouse, a guard with a ledger and a scar and no patience for haggling. Coins change hands, names get written down, and behind the clerk's hard stare, there's the unspoken message that everyone understands. If you try to cheat, if you try to sneak around, the hill has ways of dealing with people. The Saxons were devout Christians, but they were also practical. They knew the local villagers believed in things far older than the church. In the mountains around Bran, people spoke of strigoi, restless dead that crawled out of their graves to torment the living. They whispered about moroi, spirits that sucked the life out of cattle and children. They told stories of wolves that were not quite wolves, men that were not quite men. You didn't argue with that kind of belief. You folded it into your power. So when someone went missing in the forest, it was easy for the market in Brasov to murmur, "The woods are cursed, don't wander there." But when someone went missing near Bran, the story shifted. The castle demands a price, it always has. Was that a literal belief or just a way of scaring smugglers into line? Hard to say. But once a story like that is born, it's very hard to kill. The first time Bran's walls saw real, organized horror wasn't with Dracula, but with simple medieval justice. The castle had dungeons, not theatrical haunted house torture chambers with neat labels, real cramped rooms cut into stone, where air and light were luxuries withheld as part of the sentence. Chains bolted to the walls, a bucket in the corner sometimes. It housed highwaymen, rebels, spies, and anyone unlucky enough to anger the people who held the keys. In one of those cells, so the local story goes, a bandit chief died cursing the castle. He'd been caught attacking caravans in the pass, and the Saxons wanted to make an example. They kept him alive just long enough that the rumor could spread. He has sworn that none who wrongfully profit from this hill will meet a peaceful end. Did he really say that? Or did someone embellish his last groan over wine later that night? It doesn't matter. The idea stuck. Each cruel guard, each corrupt official, each greedy merchant who ended up sick, bankrupt, or dead fed the idea that Bran was not a neutral piece of stone. It kept a ledger of its own. And then there was Vlad. You can't say the word Dracula without conjuring images that Bram Stoker never intended. Slicked back hair, red lining on a cloak, fangs glinting over a pale neck. The funny thing is, the real Vlad III Dracula would have been insulted by that. Fangs? Bats? He wanted you to see something much worse when you heard his name. Vlad was Prince of Wallachia in the 15th century, a frontier ruler trying to navigate between Hungary to the west and the Ottoman Empire to the south and east. He owed both sides favors he didn't want to repay. At one point in his youth, he'd been an Ottoman hostage. Later, he turned on them with a viciousness that made his contemporaries flinch. His favorite method of making a point was impalement, wooden stakes, human bodies, fields of them. He signed his letters Dracula, the son of the dragon, after his father's chivalric order. To his enemies, it sounded a lot like devil. Did Vlad ever live in Bran Castle? Strictly speaking, history is fuzzy. He had stronger ties to other fortresses, but he fought, traded, negotiated, and made war in exactly the borderlands Bran was designed to watch over. He certainly passed through this corridor, through this town, under these walls. Some sources suggest he may have been held briefly in a fortress in this region when his relationship with the Hungarian king soured. Whether it was Bran or a neighboring stronghold almost doesn't matter. Once Stoker's novel came out centuries later and people went looking for a Dracula castle, Bran fit the bill in the popular imagination, perched, jagged, remote-looking, sitting right where Vlad's shadow falls on the map. Imagine Vlad riding up that pass, the winter wind cutting through his cloak. Behind him a column of horsemen, armor rattling, banners stiff in the cold. He looks up at the castle, at the Saxon symbol of power, and his jaw tightens. He had reasons to hate the Transylvanian Saxons. He burned their villages when they supported rivals. He accused them of gouging prices, of betraying Wallachia to foreign powers. In his mind, a place like Bran, profiting from every cart that passed, was an affront, a parasite. Now turn that image around. Imagine being a Saxon merchant or a Hungarian official in Bran, hearing that Vlad the Impaler is in the neighborhood. You know the stories. You know that when he makes camp, he sometimes leaves behind forests of corpses as a calling card. You look out from the battlements and the woods seem full of sharp sticks already. Every creak of the trees in the wind sounds like wood sliding through flesh. You might start to think, even if you're not the superstitious type, that this castle is now part of that darkness. That being situated between Vlad and the Sultan is more than just politically dangerous. It's cosmically unlucky. Some of the earliest cursed stories about Bran mentioned lights in the tower when nobody was supposedly inside. Screams heard from the hill on nights when the dungeons were empty. Strange animal carcasses found arranged in patterns near the walls. If you strip away the supernatural interpretation, there are plenty of explanations: bored guards, petty cruelty, foxes, wolves, desperate villagers staging omens to scare away tax collectors. But think of the mindset. You're living in a world where war, plague, famine, and sudden violence are normal. You hear about impaled men groaning in fields not so far away. You walk past a castle that seems to stare down at you. Your imagination doesn't need much encouragement. The centuries rolled on. The Ottoman advance slowed and shifted. Hungary changed. The patterns of power in the region morphed like clouds, but Bran kept doing its job, quietly controlling that pass. Inside, though, things changed. Some of those rude utilitarian rooms became more comfortable. Fireplaces multiplied. Wooden galleries were built. Noble families came and went, each leaving their mark on the furniture, the plaster, the gardens. The curse, if we can call it that, adapted right along with them. There's a particular kind of story that clings to old European houses: the lady in white, the woman betrayed, the girl who died young. Bran has its own versions. One tells of a noblewoman married to a man who treated the castle like a ledger, counting only profit and loss. He kept the best rooms for himself and his guards. He used the peasants like tools. When rumors spread that she gave food to the poor, he locked her in a chamber high in the tower and forbade her to leave. On stormy nights, they say, she would step out onto a narrow balcony, gripping the cold stone, listening to the wind howl through the pass. Below, somewhere in the dark, people trudged along the road, packs on their backs, carts creaking. She called down once, offering blessings to any who could hear. The next morning, the story goes, her body was found at the foot of the tower. The official line? Accident. A slip in the rain. The unofficial version, whispered by the servants, her husband pushed her. Either way, people began to say that those who profit from Bran without compassion will be visited by the lady in white. That when deals are made in greed in its rooms, a cold draft passes, as if someone has walked through the walls to listen. Is any of that provable? Of course not. But this is how a castle becomes cursed in the old European sense, not just by being the site of violence, but by becoming a stage where the same pattern plays out again and again: power, cruelty, sudden ruin. As Europe stumbled into the modern age, Bran could easily have become obsolete. Gunpowder artillery made vertical walls less useful, roads improved, railways began to carve new paths through the landscape. The castle sat, weathering, half forgotten. For a while it felt less like a cursed fortress and more like a leftover bone on the land's plate. Then something happened that would change its destiny forever: the birth of modern myth through print. In the late 19th century, Bram Stoker, an Irish theater manager with a fascination for the occult, wrote a novel about a Transylvanian count who drinks blood and moves in the spaces between life and death. He had never seen Bran Castle. He'd never set foot in Romania. He worked from books, travelers' tales, and his own imagination. The castle in his novel, perched above a gorge, accessible only by a winding road and a precarious bridge, was an imagined composite, a kind of distilled symbol of every dark, remote fortress he'd ever read about. But once the book was out in the world and started to seep into the public consciousness, people wanted to find the real place. Where is Dracula's castle? Where is the home of this creature that symbolizes lust and death and foreign terror? Tourism and scholarship went hunting. Several sites were proposed, but Bran had a winning combination. It looked the part, and it was accessible enough to sell tickets. It didn't happen all at once. In the early 20th century, Bran was more closely associated with a very human, very real figure: Queen Marie of Romania. If you walk through the castle today and you step into the light, airy rooms with carved wooden furniture, colored tiles, and vases of flowers and old photographs, you're looking at her legacy. Marie was born a British princess, married into the Romanian royal family, and fell deeply in love with this country of mountains and stories. When the people of Brasov offered Bran Castle to her as a token of gratitude after the First World War, she accepted and began to transform it. She wasn't interested in making a cold, echoing fortress. She wanted a retreat. She installed whitewashed walls, cozy fireplaces, curved doorways. She filled rooms with folk art, rugs, carved chests, icons, things that connected the royal residence to the country around it. She wandered the courtyard with her dogs. She wrote in her diaries about the peace she found here, the way the wind through the pass seemed to carry voices from long ago. But even in this almost fairy tale phase, you can feel the curse flexing under the surface. Because Marie's life was not a fairy tale. She lived through the First World War, nursing wounded soldiers, watching her country invaded, bargaining with great powers for its survival. She suffered personal losses, children struck by illness, political betrayals, the slow erosion of royal authority in a Europe growing impatient with kings and queens. There's a story that during the war, wounded soldiers were brought up to Bran. The castle became, for a brief time, a refuge and a hospital. Imagine lying on a makeshift bed in a medieval hall, the ceiling beams old when your grandparents were children, listening to the groans of the injured, the soft steps of nurses, the distant howl of wolves in the forest. You reach out and touch the wall and feel not just stone, but centuries. You might easily think, how many others bled here? How many languages has this corridor heard people screaming in? Marie, with her spiritual leanings and her fondness for symbols, understood this. She once described Bran as a place where souls of other times seemed close. Not ominous to her, but intimate. Yet as the years went on and she faced illness and political marginalization, the stories around her and the castle twisted again. When she died, her body was buried elsewhere, but her heart, the literal organ, was placed in a special casket and interred in a chapel near Bran. People came to see it, this relic of a beloved queen whose public image was almost saintly. Over time, regimes changed, and her heart was moved, hidden, relocated. The chapel decayed. Some said the queen's spirit was offended, that the desecration of her chosen resting place had disturbed the peace she'd found here. Visitors and guards told stories of feeling a sudden, sharp sadness in certain rooms, tears welling up for no clear reason, of a perfume, faint and old-fashioned, lingering in the air when no one had passed through for hours. So now the curse had another layer, not just impaled men and bandits and harsh tax collectors, a queen whose heart literally belonged to this place, uprooted and displaced by a country that no longer had room for monarchs. Then came Europe's most violently cursed decades, the middle of the 20th century. In the 1930s, storm clouds gathered again. Fascism, nationalism, an echo of the old empire's ambitions, louder and more poisonous. Bran sat in a country trying to navigate alliances and threats. As the Second World War began, the castle watched armies move again in the distance, the way it had in medieval times. But war had changed. The danger no longer came as much from horsemen in the pass as from bombers in the sky and men in uniforms with crisp insignia drawing lines on maps. There are stories, half remembered, half invented, about Nazi officers visiting Bran, of officers being given tours, peering at the defensive positions, perhaps imagining how the rocky hill could be used as a strong point. There are rumors of secret meetings, of hidden caches, of bits of confiscated art passed through its cellars. Some of these tales are probably local embroidery. Every old castle in Europe seems to have a story about Nazis in the wine cellar. But the fact remains, the ideology of that time seeped everywhere. It soaked into people's lives. And any place that had stood for defensive power and control for centuries was bound to become a symbol, if only in people's minds, of the way history seemed unable to let this part of the world rest. When the war ended and the Red Army's shadow fell across Romania, Bran's fate twisted again. The royal family was forced into exile. Their properties were seized by the communist state. Bran Castle, once a royal retreat, once a medieval fortress, now had to become something entirely different, a socialist museum. On paper, that sounds almost tidy. A castle becomes a museum, open to the people, full of carefully curated exhibits. In reality, it was messy. The new regime was suspicious of anything that smelled of aristocracy, religion, or superstition. Bran had all three in spades. It had formerly been a royal residence. It had chapels and icons. It reeked of myth. So the solution was simple. Sanitize it. turn it into a museum of history and architecture, focus on the stonework, the building techniques, the harmless medieval curiosities, the ghosts, the curses, the royal heart in its chapel. Those were things best left in the shadows. Guides were expected to stick to a script. Visitors walked through rooms stripped of many personal objects, seeing them as a timeline, not a living memory. But places have a way of resisting scripts. Former guards and guides, especially those who worked the night shift, tell stories that do not fit neatly into Marxist-Leninist materialism. They talk about walking the corridors after closing and hearing footsteps on the level above when they knew every door was locked. They talk about lights flickering, not in the way an old electrical system does, but in a pattern as if someone were moving from room to room, switching them on and off. One spoke of a time when he passed by a small, rounded doorway and saw, just for a moment, the figure of a woman in what looked like early 20th century clothing, standing with her back to him. When he stepped into the room, it was empty, the air unusually cold. Now, maybe that was stress. Maybe it was the echo of tourist chatter in a stone building. Maybe it was his subconscious replaying old photographs of Queen Marie. But here's the important thing. He didn't tell that story in tourist brochures. He told it whispering, over a drink years later. Because even under a regime that insisted curses were superstitions, the people living and working in Bran carried on a quieter tradition, treating the castle like a living presence. Accidents seemed to happen here with a frequency that people noticed. A worker repairing a roof plank slipped and survived, but he swore a cold hand had gripped his ankle. A curator carrying a stack of old documents down a narrow stairwell stumbled, the papers flying. And when he scrambled to gather them, he found a photograph he'd never seen before, fallen open at his feet. A shot of the same stairs decades earlier, guarded by a grim-faced soldier. Coincidence? Sure. But each event nudged the narrative. The castle doesn't like that, people would say, half joking, when changes were proposed that felt too disrespectful. You'll see, it has its way. By now, Bran's curse wasn't just about supernatural events. It was about a pattern of human misery circling the same piece of rock, medieval bandits, impaled enemies, oppressed peasants, a melancholy queen, wounded soldiers, Nazis and communists. The castle sat like a witness in the dock while history paraded atrocity after atrocity in front of it. Anyone paying attention could be forgiven for thinking, whatever gods or fates designed this part of Europe, they have a dark sense of humor. When the communist regime fell at the end of the 20th century and Romania stumbled into a new era, Bran's story shifted again, dramatically and fast. The royal descendants pressed claims to get their properties back. Legal battles ensued. Old paperwork emerged. For a while, the castle's fate hung in the balance, just as it had when Vlad glared at the walls or when communist officials numbered its rooms on a clipboard. And then, in a twist worthy of a novel, pop culture swept in like a tidal wave. Dracula, who had been quietly gathering power in books, films, and Halloween costumes, suddenly became not just a literary figure but a global brand. Tourism agencies, entrepreneurs, and local authorities looked up at Bran and saw dollar signs, or euro signs, or whatever currency you like. The castle that had once frightened villagers with whispered tales of bandits and ghosts could now frighten tourists and sell them snacks on the way out. It was rebranded, in the collective imagination, as Dracula's castle, never mind the quibbles of historians. The silhouette matched the posters. The name sounded right. The rest would take care of itself. So the floodgates opened. Tour buses full of visitors from every corner of the world climbed the hill. Souvenir stalls sprouted plastic fangs and fake blood capsules. Guided tours leaned heavily into the vampire angle. And the castle, which had once terrified people who depended on its protection, now played host to people who paid good money to be safely scared. If you walk through Bran on a busy summer day now, the atmosphere is almost cheerful. Kids giggle in the narrow spiral staircases. Couples pose for photos on the battlements. Audio guides whisper in a dozen languages, offering little chunks of history along with the expected Dracula references. It would be easy to think the curse has finally been diluted into something harmless, like a strong wine cut with cheap soda. But talk to the people who work there year-round, who see the castle when the buses are gone and the fog wraps the hill in silence, and you'll hear a slightly different story. They'll tell you about visitors who faint in the same few rooms, over and over, even when the heat isn't particularly bad. They'll mention that for whatever reason, it's often in the old torture exhibition or in a particular tower chamber where the stone seems to close in. They'll talk about cameras that malfunction in ways technicians can't quite replicate later. Photos that show strange blurs, shapes in windows that don't line up with any known reflection. Phones that die with full batteries in the same section of a hallway. Again, there are plenty of rational explanations. Old wiring, poor ventilation, suggestible minds overloaded with spooky stories. But the repetition of it, the pattern, fuels the feeling that Bran still has its own rules. That it is not just an empty shell decorated arbitrarily with vampire posters, but a place with a memory. One of the creepiest modern stories involves the well in the central courtyard. It's a beautiful feature at first glance. A stone cylinder, a bucket, a reminder of how people once drew water within the safety of the walls. Tourists lean over the edge and peer down, dropping coins and wishes. But not so long ago, a maintenance team had to go down into the shaft to check on the stonework. As they descended, one of the workers reported hearing voices, not clear, distinct words, but a low murmur, almost like the sound an audience makes in a theater before a performance. He called up to his colleagues to ask if someone was speaking above. They weren't. When tapes of the descent were later played back, the sound was faintly there, a sort of breathy whisper in the background. Audio experts could probably tell you it was just the movement of air or the squeak of ropes. Leave that explanation aside for a moment, though, and think about what a well is in a place like Bran. It's an opening between levels of the castle, yes, but also between the world of the living and the world below. In some traditions, wells are gateways, places where offerings are thrown to the unseen. For centuries, people have leaned over that stone circle and projected their fears and hopes into it. Is it any wonder that the human brain, primed by stories, might hear something when it listens? There's another story, quieter, that I find more unsettling than any talk of ghosts. A guide noticed that certain visitors, especially older ones, would sometimes break away from their group and retreat to a corner in a particular corridor. They would stand there, touching the stone, eyes closed. When asked if they were all right, they'd say things like, "It's nothing, I just needed a moment." One finally explained that the curve of the wall, the angle of the window, the way the cold air moved reminded them of another place, another time, a prison, a wartime shelter, a childhood spent in cramped quarters under a different regime. Bran, without meaning to, was triggering living memories of past curses in people's minds. So what is the curse here, really? Is it a literal malediction, some words spoken over the foundations by an angry bandit or a grieving queen? Is it a legion of ghosts stacking up century after century until the corridors are crowded with invisible figures? Or is it something more complicated, a sort of spiritual gravity generated by the sheer density of fear, violence, longing, and betrayal that has passed through this structure over 700 years? Europe is full of castles. Some of them are magnificent, ornate palaces built more for display than defense. Others are ruined stumps on hills, their stories dissolved into the grass. Bran sits in a different category. It's not the biggest, fanciest, or bloodiest fortress on the continent. There are places where more people died, where more battles were fought. But few have been so perfectly placed to absorb every major anxiety of their region, from medieval banditry to royal drama, from fascism to communism to modern capitalism dressed up in vampire capes. That's the secret behind its reputation as Europe's most cursed castle. The curse is not a single event. It's a stack of layers, laid down like sediment at the bottom of a long, troubled river. Each generation leaves something behind, a fear, a rumor, a superstition, a personal heartbreak. The building doesn't forget, and when you walk through it today, you brush against all of that, often without realizing it. Think about the pattern. First, control and exploitation. Saxon merchants using the castle to tax peasants and traders, exacting wealth from those who had no choice but to pass beneath its walls. That breeds resentment, hatred, stories of greedy officials falling into ruin, a soft curse of social karma. Then, violent spectacle. Vlad the Impaler and his era, when terror was a political tool and forests of stakes were as effective as any press release. A region traumatized by deliberate cruelty. A fortress standing nearby, whether complicit or merely a spectator, absorbing that atmosphere. Then, personal tragedy in a royal key. Queen Marie turning Bran into a home, pouring love and energy into it, only to see her world swept away by forces beyond her control. Her heart literally buried near its walls, then uprooted. A sense of promise betrayed, of devotion disregarded. Then, Ideological possession, Nazis peering at its defenses, communists seizing it as state property, stripping it of overt superstition while quietly trampling on the personal and religious significance it held for so many. Workers walking its corridors under portraits of leaders who demanded disbelief in anything but party doctrine, even as their skin crawled in the empty halls at night. Finally, commercialization, vampires and t-shirts, cheap horror layered on top of very real past horrors. A new form of exploitation, selling the castle's dark reputation back to visitors as entertainment. Depending on how you see it, that's either cathartic, a way of reclaiming trauma with laughter, or the final twist of the knife, turning a space heavy with genuine suffering into a theme park. A curse, in myth, is usually a punishment. Someone offends a god, breaks an oath, sheds innocent blood, and doom follows. If you look at Bran's long story, you can almost hear the land itself saying, "You keep using this place to control and frighten and profit from each other." Fine, I'll make sure it never feels clean. I'll make sure people always walk away unnerved, even when they can't say why. Of course, there are those who absolutely love the castle, artists who find it quietly inspiring, historians who delight in its nooks and crannies, couples who get married in its shadow, hoping that centuries of endurance will bless their vows. And maybe that's part of the curse as well, its inability to be simple. It can be a romantic backdrop and a haunted fortress at the same time, a royal home and a tax collector's tower, a museum and a mausoleum. If you ever go there yourself, and if you haven't, just imagine it fully now. Pay attention to the small things. The way your footsteps sound different in different rooms, sometimes hollow, sometimes strangely muffled. The tilt of the floors, worn down by boots and slippers and bare feet. The tiny window seats where someone centuries ago probably sat and watched snowfall in the courtyard. The chipped edge of a stair where something heavy was dropped or someone stumbled and grabbed hold desperately. You might not see a vampire, you almost certainly won't, but you might feel something more subtle, the way your own mind starts filling the gaps. The moment in a narrow passage when you suddenly don't want anyone walking behind you because you're sure that if you turned around at the wrong moment, there would be someone there who doesn't belong to your time. And if, at closing, you happen to be the last person out, walking down the path as the lights blink on in the towers above, look back. The walls will be yellow-white in the artificial glow. The windows, black. Somewhere up there, a cleaner will be sweeping, a security guard checking locks, maybe humming to himself to keep his nerves steady. But Bran, the real Bran, doesn't live in the hum. It lives in the silence between those sounds, in the pause before the broom moves again, in the guard's decision not to look too long into that unlit doorway. Is the castle cursed? In the strict supernatural sense, no one can prove it. In the human sense, it might be one of the most cursed places in Europe, not because of a single dark deed, but because it has been forced, over and over again, to play host to our worst habits: greed, fear, cruelty, romanticized suffering, and the urge to turn all of that into a story we can sell. But maybe that's why we keep coming back to it. Bran Castle lets us walk, safely, through the architecture of our own darkness. It lets us dress centuries of pain in the cape of Dracula and laugh nervously in the gift shop afterward. It gives us a way to say, the curse is over there, in that castle on that hill, instead of recognizing how much of it we carry in ourselves. Yet, the hill remembers, the stones remember, and on some cold night, long after the last tourist group has pasted their smiling photos online and forgotten the prickling feeling on the back of their neck in that one particular room, the wind will rise in the pass again. It will rush through the same gap in the rocks it has used for thousands of years, up against the same walls, over the same battlements. It will rattle a loose shutter, moan in a chimney, stir a curtain in a high tower window. From down below, maybe a villager walking home late will look up and think, just for a second, that they see a figure standing there, framed in the glow of a light. A man in armor, a woman in a white dress, a queen with something clasped to her chest, a boy watching soldiers in strange uniforms march past, or maybe just their own reflection, magnified by centuries. They'll blink, and the window will be empty. They'll tell themselves it was nothing, just a trick of the floodlights and the glass. And Bran Castle, Europe's most cursed castle, will settle back into its favorite role, a dark shape on the hill, waiting patiently for the next story, the next generation, the next set of footsteps to echo in its halls and add another whisper to the long, uneasy chorus in its stones.